193 buildings, 3 left standing. In a single housing complex in Caracas, 98% of the towers came down, and the ones that survived are surrounded by the rubble of the ones that did not. That is not what bad luck looks like. That is what a pattern looks like. Nearly 800 buildings have collapsed in Venezuela, almost all of them in the same way, and a single video of foam inside the wreckage has the whole world convinced it already knows why. But the news is pointing at the wrong scandal. The real reason is hidden in the ground, and in a warning this country received and ignored decades ago. Stay with me to the end, because the truth changes everything. If that gap between knowing and building unsettles you, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Comment where you are watching from, and whether your city sits on solid rock or soft fill. Now, let's get into it. 39 seconds is all it took. That is the gap between the 2 earthquakes that struck near Caracas, Venezuela, on June 24, 2026. The first measured magnitude, 7.2. The second, arriving while the dust from the first was still in the air, measured 7.5. And in that span, shorter than the time it takes to read this sentence aloud twice, a capital city and the coast below it began to come apart. I want you to sit with that timing for a moment, because it matters more than almost anything else about this disaster. When a building is hit by a powerful earthquake, it does not simply pass or fail in an instant. It is wounded. Columns crack, joints loosen, walls shift off their footings. A structure that survives the first shock is often standing on borrowed strength, holding itself together by habit. And then, before anyone inside can move, before a single person can reach a doorway or a stairwell, the second and larger shock arrives and finishes what the first one started. That is what 39 seconds bought. 2 blows, back to back, on a city that turned out to be far less ready for either one than anyone wanted to believe. The numbers we're getting now are difficult to even say out loud. The confirmed dead stands somewhere between 1,430 and 1,450 in the latest major reports. The injured are counted between 3,150 and 3,238. But the figure that truly captures the scale of this is the one nobody can pin down. The number of people still missing, still unaccounted for, sits above 68,000 in the highest estimates. Some outlets say 50,000. Some say 55,000. What we can be certain of is this: tens of thousands of human beings are still missing, and the search for them is racing a clock that has, by now, almost run out. Nearly 800 buildings have collapsed. Let me say that again, because it is the heart of everything we're going to talk about today. Almost 800 buildings, in and around one city, are simply gone, folded into rubble, and the ones that are still standing are not safe. Many of them are so badly damaged that they could come down on their own, with no further shaking at all. If you look at the aerial footage coming out of the worst hit districts, you have probably had the same reaction I did. It does not look like a natural disaster. It looks like a war. It looks like the images we have all seen from cities hit by missiles, towers with their faces torn off, floors pancaked one onto the next, walls leaning at angles that should not be possible. The hardest hit area is a coastal state called La Guaira, about 40 kilometers or 25 miles north of Caracas. This is a stretch of shoreline lined with residential towers, many of them with swimming pools, built right up against the Caribbean. Dozens upon dozens of those buildings collapsed into rubble. In that one area alone, nearly 13,000 people have been displaced, and the rescuers working there are doing something almost beyond comprehension. They are climbing into half-collapsed structures while the tower right beside them leans and groans, knowing that the next tremor could bring the neighbor down on top of them. They are risking their own lives, not metaphorically, but in the most literal way, to pull strangers out of the dark. Over the weekend, at least 33 people were rescued alive, including children. And I want you to hold two numbers in your mind at the same time, because the gap between them is the thing that keeps me up at night. Tens of thousands missing. 33 pulled out alive. That gap is the shape of this tragedy. And it is getting wider with every hour, because the window that gives rescuers their best chance has already closed. Experts call it the 72-hour window. The first 72 hours after a collapse are considered the most crucial for finding survivors. A Swiss rescue team leader put it plainly. Survival probability drops sharply after roughly 3 days. We are now in the 4th day. We are past the line, and that is the unbearable arithmetic the rescuers in Caracas are living inside right now, sorting through 800 collapsed buildings, knowing the odds turn against them with every sunrise. To grasp how large this has become, look at what it has taken to respond to it. 24 countries have sent help. Nearly 600 tons of supplies have been flown in. 86 specially trained search dog teams are working the rubble, noses to the concrete, because a trained dog can find a living person buried under collapsed floors faster than any machine we have ever built. More than 2,740 international search and rescue and support personnel are now on the ground, backing up around 30,000 Venezuelan specialists. And the early estimate of the direct physical damage already sits at $6.7 billion. That is the footprint of a single doublet of earthquakes, 39 seconds of shaking, measured in nations, in tons, and in billions of dollars. And to understand just how violent that shaking was, it helps to know where these two earthquakes rank in the country's entire recorded history. The strongest earthquake Venezuela has ever recorded was a magnitude 7.7 back in 1900. The second strongest is this one, the 7.5 that struck on June 24th. Third place belongs to a magnitude 7.3 in 2018. And fourth place is also this event, the 7.2 that came first in the doublet. Then, in fifth, a magnitude 7.0 in 1997. Read that ranking again, because it is almost hard to believe. In a single window of 39 seconds, Venezuela experienced both the second and the fourth most powerful earthquakes in its entire recorded history. Not across a year. Not across a decade, in 39 seconds. So that is where we begin. A doublet of earthquakes, 39 seconds apart, 800 buildings down, tens of thousands missing. But the question that has taken over every feed, every comment section, every conversation about this disaster is not really about the earthquake at all. It is about the buildings. Because when the rescuers started pulling at the rubble, they found something inside it that did not look like concrete at all. And what they found has turned a natural disaster into something that feels much more like an accusation. There is a video. By now, you may have seen it, because it is spread everywhere, and it is the reason this story stopped being only about geology and started being about something far more uncomfortable. In the footage, a rescuer is standing on the wreckage of a collapsed building, and he reaches down and touches one of the structural elements, one of the pieces that was supposedly holding the building up. And it does not behave like concrete. He pulls at it. He breaks pieces off with his bare hands. It is porous. It is light. It looks, for all the world, like styrofoam. In Venezuela, people have a name for this material. They call it anime. The technical name is expanded polystyrene, or EPS. It is the same family of material as the white foam that protects a television in its box, or a disposable coffee cup. And there it was, apparently, inside the bones of a building that thousands of people had been living in. The rescuers in the video are visibly surprised. You can see it in how they handle it. This disbelief that the thing they are touching, the thing that was meant to carry the weight of an entire tower, crumbles like packing foam. And the moment that footage spread, a single question caught fire across the country and around the world. Were corners cut? Is this why the towers fell? Is this why so many of them seem to collapse in the same way, folding straight down, floor onto floor, as if the structure underneath had simply dissolved? Because here is a detail that makes the question almost impossible to ignore. Many of these buildings were not built one at a time by different people. They were built in the same projects by the same contractors. Some of those contractors, according to reports circulating online, were foreign, with names from Russia and from China attached to them. Now, I want to be careful and honest here. We cannot confirm which specific fallen tower was built by whom. That attribution is not something anyone can responsibly make right now. But the pattern itself, the sameness of the failure, is exactly what makes people suspect a shared cause. It is worth being precise about what people mean when they say the buildings fell in the same way, because that phrase is doing a great deal of work. They do not simply mean that the buildings fell down. They mean that tower after tower failed in the same particular manner, collapsing straight down, each floor dropping flat onto the one beneath it in what engineers grimly call a pancake collapse. When one building fails that way, you can explain it a dozen ways. When dozens of them fail that way, across different sites and different neighborhoods, the mind starts hunting for the single thing they all had in common. And in a place where the same contractors built project after project, that suspicion writes itself. And then there is the one development that turns the suspicion into something colder. There is a housing complex built in the Hugo Chavez era that has become the center of this entire debate. It was home to roughly 7,000 people. It was made up of 193 buildings. And according to reports, after the earthquakes, only 3 of those 193 buildings remained standing. Sit with that ratio. 193 down to 3. That is not the signature of bad luck. That is not random variation in the ground. When 98% of a single development is erased while 3 lonely towers remain, you are no longer looking at chance. You are looking at something systemic. This complex was not built as luxury housing. Its purpose was the opposite. It was constructed in 2011 to relocate thousands of people who had been displaced by catastrophic rains the year before, in 2010, and to give low-income families a place to live. These were homes built for people who had already lost everything once. And now, according to the reporting, lightweight materials such as expanded polystyrene, that same anime, were used in parts of their construction. Think for a moment about who actually lived in a place like that. These were families who had been moved there precisely because they were vulnerable, people the state had promised to protect by giving them somewhere safe to live. The entire purpose of the project was shelter, and when the ground moved, that shelter became the most dangerous place they could possibly have been. There is a particular cruelty in a building meant to be a rescue from one disaster becoming the cause of the next one. Whatever the investigation finally concludes about the materials, that is the human shape of this story, and it is worth holding on to as the technical arguments fly back and forth. So the experts looking at this disaster have started naming the possible causes out loud. Low quality of the materials, a lack of supervision while the buildings were going up, and the absence of enforced anti-seismic construction rules. The building codes that are supposed to make a structure survive exactly this kind of shaking. 193 buildings and 3 left standing. As a starting point for an investigation, that is about as damning a number as you will ever hear. But here is where I have to slow us down. Because the easy story, the satisfying story, the one where greedy builders filled the columns with foam, and that is the whole answer, may not actually be the true story. Or at least it may not be the complete one. There are engineers, serious people who do this for a living, who looked at that same viral video and saw something very different from what the rest of us saw. And what they are saying complicates everything, So before we convict anyone, we have to ask a harder question. What were we actually looking at in that footage? Because the answer might not be a column at all. Let me give you the counter-argument, because it is important, and because it is the kind of thing that does not make a good headline, but happens to be how engineering actually works. Expanded polystyrene, the anime in that video, is in fact used in construction. That part is true. But the engineers point out it is not used inside load-bearing columns. It has two completely legitimate jobs on a building site, and neither one of them involves holding up the weight of a tower. The first job is something called lost formwork. When builders need to shape a piece of concrete into a particular form, especially a decorative element or a hollow beam, they sometimes use a block of foam as an internal mold. They pour and shape the concrete around it, and the foam simply stays inside afterward, because there is no reason to dig it back out. The weight, the actual structural strength, is carried by the steel and the concrete on the outside. The foam is just a shape that got left behind. The second job is even more relevant to what we are seeing. It is called an expansion joint. When you construct a very large building, or when two structures are built right against each other, you cannot make them rigidly solid as one block. The ground shifts. Concrete expands and contracts as the temperature changes through the day. So engineers deliberately leave a gap, sometimes only a few centimeters wide, between two sections, so that each one can move independently when the earth shakes or the material swells in the heat. If they did not, the two sections would grind into each other and tear each other apart. And to keep that gap clean while the concrete is being poured, to stop fresh cement from slumping into the space, they fill it with a vertical sheet of foam, anime. The weight is carried by the beams and the columns on either side. The foam sheet carries nothing at all. It is a spacer. Now think about what happens when that building collapses. The concrete shatters and falls away, and that vertical foam sheet, the expansion joint, is suddenly exposed to the open air. A rescuer climbs onto the rubble, sees a large panel of what looks like styrofoam standing where the structure used to be, and to an untrained eye, and to all of us watching at home, it looks exactly as if the column itself was made of foam. But it was never a column. It was the gap between columns. And there is one more piece of evidence that the engineers keep pointing to, and it is, frankly, the most convincing of all. A real load-bearing column in any proper building, government or private, has a dense cage of steel inside it. Reinforcing steel bars, what we call rebar, woven into a thick skeleton and then filled with high-strength concrete. That steel is the entire reason a column can hold a building up. And in the video, where the foam is, there is no steel. The anime is stuck to a flat element, a wall, or a panel, with none of the rebar cage that a true column absolutely requires. And the logic that follows is hard to argue with. If that piece of foam had genuinely been the support holding up the building, the structure would not have lasted a single day after it was built, let alone stood for years with thousands of people living inside it. A foam column does not survive its own construction. It certainly does not survive a decade. And the reason this distinction matters so much is not academic hair-splitting. If the country convinces itself that the whole disaster was nothing more than foam where concrete should have been, then the investigation stops at a cartoon villain, a handful of corrupt builders, and the much larger and more dangerous truth goes unexamined. The foam is satisfying to be angry about. It fits inside a single shocking video. But catastrophes on this scale are almost never caused by one absurd decision. They are caused by 100 small ones, each defensible on its own at the time, each made under financial pressure, quietly stacking up across years until the morning the ground decides to test every one of them at once. If we let ourselves believe the foam was the whole story, we will fix the foam, feel satisfied, and rebuild the exact same vulnerability into the next generation of towers. And when the engineers and investigators talk about what actually went wrong, the list they give is far less cinematic than a foam column and far more familiar. They talk about low-quality concrete that never had the strength it was supposed to have. They talk about reinforcing steel that was too thin, too sparse, or in some cases simply left out to save money. They talk about construction that no qualified engineer ever properly supervised, so that no one ever checked whether what was drawn on the blueprint was actually what got built. And they talk about anti-seismic rules, the rules specifically designed to make a building ride out an earthquake, that were either ignored or never enforced. Not one of those failures makes for a dramatic video. You cannot snap a photo of an absence of supervision, but stacked together on top of dangerous ground, they are far more lethal than any single block of foam could ever be. So let me say clearly where this leaves us, because I think the truth here is more disturbing than the viral version, not less. The specific dramatic claim that the columns were made of foam is probably wrong. What the rescuer is breaking with his hand is almost certainly an expansion joint or lost formwork, not the spine of the building. And I genuinely hope that holds up, because the alternative is a level of fraud that is hard to even imagine. But, and this is the part that the comforting debunk leaves out, none of that clears the construction. The foam was the wrong scandal. The real one is quieter and harder to film, because the experts are still pointing at low-quality materials, at the lack of supervision while these towers went up, and at building codes for earthquakes that existed on paper, but were never enforced in the concrete. 193 buildings still fell. 3 still stood. The foam in the video may be a misunderstanding. The reason almost 800 buildings collapsed in the same way is not. And to understand that reason, we have to stop looking at the buildings and start looking at what is underneath them. Here is something most people never think about. When an earthquake happens, the damage a building suffers does not depend only on how big the earthquake was. It depends enormously on what the building is standing on. The ground itself is not a neutral stage. The ground is a participant. Think of it this way. The energy of an earthquake travels outward from its source as seismic waves, like ripples moving through the earth. And what those waves do when they arrive at your feet depends almost entirely on what they arrive in. If you are standing on hard bedrock, the waves move through it quickly and cleanly and keep going. The rock carries the shaking and passes it along, and your building gets a sharp but relatively brief jolt. But if you are standing on soft sediment, on an old riverbed, on the fill of a drained lake, on the loose material that gathers and settles in basins and valleys over thousands of years, something very different happens. That soft ground does the opposite of bedrock. It traps the waves, it slows them down, and then it amplifies them, sometimes several times over, and it makes the shaking last far, far longer. So picture the difference. On firm ground, your building feels a hard shove that is over in moments. On soft basin sediment, that same earthquake becomes a prolonged, swelling, magnified shaking that goes on, pumping energy into your structure long after the bedrock nearby has gone still. A magnitude 7.5 is already enough to destroy, but a magnitude 7.5, caught and multiplied several times over by soft ground and stretched out in time, is a different kind of monster entirely. And here is the thing about Caracas. Parts of the city sit on exactly this kind of soft basin fill. The capital was built, in places, on the very ground that takes an earthquake and makes it worse. The towers that fell were not just hit by the shaking. They were hit by shaking that the ground beneath them had been quietly preparing to amplify for as long as that sediment had been settling there. There is one more piece of this worth understanding, because it explains why soft ground is so much deadlier than the raw magnitude suggests. It is not only that the basin makes the shaking stronger, it is that the basin makes the shaking last. A building can often survive a single violent jolt that is over in a few seconds. What buildings struggle to survive is being shaken hard, over and over, for a long stretch of time, because every cycle of motion works the cracks a little wider and loosens the joints a little more, until the structure has simply been worked to death. Soft sediment takes a short, survivable earthquake and stretches it into a long, grinding ordeal. A building that might have lived through 10 seconds of shaking does not necessarily live through 60. The ground under parts of Caracas was, in effect, holding those buildings in place and shaking them long after the earthquake itself should have let go. This is also why the failures were not uniform across the whole region, even though the headlines make it feel that way. There were buildings that did not collapse. There were structures that came through it, and when you look at where they were, a pattern starts to appear. Some of the buildings that survived were standing on different ground, on firmer ground, ground that did not trap and magnify the waves the way the basin did. The earthquake was the same for all of them. The ground was not. And that single difference, what each building happened to be standing on, helped decide which ones became shelters and which ones became tombs. So when people ask why so many towers fell in the same way, this is the first half of the answer, and it has nothing to do with foam and everything to do with physics. A city built partly on soft sediment was struck by a doublet of powerful earthquakes, and that sediment did what soft sediment always does. It took a catastrophe and amplified it into something worse. Now, if that sounds like an abstract idea, like the kind of thing that is true in theory but hard to prove, I understand. So, let me take you to the single, clearest demonstration of this principle that has ever happened. Let me take you to a city that was destroyed, not by the earthquake nearest to it, but by the ground it was built on, from an earthquake hundreds of kilometers away. Let me take you to Mexico City in the year 1985. Mexico City is built on the bed of a lake that is no longer there. Centuries ago, the area was a system of lakes, and the largest was Lake Texcoco. The lake was drained over generations, and the great city grew across the old lake bed. But the lake left something behind. Underneath much of Mexico City lies a thick layer of soft, waterlogged clay. It is some of the most treacherous ground you could possibly build a metropolis on, because it behaves, during an earthquake, almost like a bowl of jelly. In 1985, a magnitude 8 earthquake struck off the Pacific coast of Mexico, and here is the detail that should stop you cold. The epicenter was more than 250 kilometers away from Mexico City. That is more than 280 miles. By every intuition we have, the city should have felt a distant rumble, something serious but survivable, the kind of shaking that rattles windows in a faraway capital. Instead, it suffered one of the worst urban earthquake disasters of the 20th century. And the reason was the ground. When the seismic waves from that distant coast finally reached the old lakebed under Mexico City, the soft clay began to do something extraordinary. It began to resonate. Like a drum that has been struck, the basin started shaking back and forth, and it kept shaking for minutes, long after the bedrock would have gone quiet. And the rhythm of that shaking, the frequency at which the clay swayed, happened to match the natural sway of the mid-sized buildings standing on top of it. When the rhythm of the ground matches the rhythm of a building, the building does not just shake, it is driven, pushed harder and harder in time with its own motion, like a child on a swing being pushed at exactly the right moment every time. The energy builds and builds, and the structure tears itself apart. Around 400 buildings collapsed. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives. And the cruelest part, the part that proves the entire point, is what happened on the coast. The towns that were actually close to the epicenter, the places that took the earthquake head on, suffered comparatively lighter damage. The faraway city, the one separated from the rupture by hundreds of kilometers, was devastated. Distance from the earthquake turned out to matter less than the ground each place was built on. The soft lake bed of Mexico City reached out across all that distance and pulled the catastrophe in. But Mexico did something with that horror. They learned. They took that lesson and they rebuilt their entire approach to earthquakes around it. They rewrote their building codes specifically to account for the ground, for how different soils amplify shaking in different ways. They installed the first public earthquake early warning system in all of the Americas, a network that can give people in the city precious seconds of warning before the shaking arrives. And then, in 2017, the test came. A magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck almost directly beneath Mexico City. And while it was still a tragedy, while buildings still fell and people still died, far fewer buildings collapsed than in 1985. It is worth being clear about how unusual Mexico's response really was, because it is easy to say a country learned its lesson and much harder to actually do it. Mexico did not just add a few rules and move on. They reshaped how the entire city thinks about the ground beneath its feet, mapping which neighborhoods sit on the old lake bed and requiring that buildings there be engineered for the specific, treacherous way that clay behaves. They built a warning network so that a school in the city center could have its alarm sounding before the shaking from a distant coast ever arrived. None of that is glamorous. None of it makes the news in the long, calm years between earthquakes, when the danger feels like a story from a history book. It is the unglamorous, expensive, patient work of continuing to take a disaster seriously after the rest of the world has moved on. And it is precisely that patient work that did not happen in Caracas. Now think carefully about why. The ground had not changed. The soft clay was exactly where it had always been, ready to resonate like a drum all over again. What had changed was what they built on top of it, and how the whole society had decided to prepare. The ground was the same. The response was not. And that distinction between the ground you cannot change and the choices you can is the entire story of why some nations survive their earthquakes and others are buried by them. Which brings us back to Venezuela, and to a question that is much harder to forgive than bad soil. Because the soft ground under Caracas is not a secret. They knew about it. They had been warned in the most direct way possible, decades ago. Venezuela has been shaken before. Hard. This is not a country that was caught off guard by the very idea of an earthquake. The ground there has a long and brutal memory, and the people have lived through its lessons more than once. Go back to 1812. A powerful earthquake struck and destroyed Caracas, killing thousands, and it struck at a moment so politically charged in the middle of the country's independence movement that the disaster nearly broke the movement itself. That is more than 2 centuries ago, but it established something that should never have been forgotten. This city, this exact place, is a place where the earth kills on a massive scale. Then come forward to 1967. Another earthquake struck Caracas directly, and it did something that should have been treated as a final, unmistakable warning. It collapsed modern apartment blocks in almost the same way we are seeing now, folding them down floor onto floor. And it demonstrated in front of everyone exactly how the soil beneath parts of Caracas makes the shaking worse. The very amplification we just talked about with Mexico City. The 1967 disaster was not a mystery. It was a diagnosis. The ground was named as the culprit. The danger was written down in the rubble for anyone to read. And here is the thing. The knowledge did exist. The 1967 disaster even produced new design rules, new codes meant to make buildings survive the next one. So you might ask, if they knew the ground was dangerous, and they wrote rules to account for it, why are we standing in this rubble again in 2026? And the answer is the most important sentence in this entire story. A building code written after one catastrophe only saves lives if it is actually enforced through the long, quiet decades that follow. The code is not the protection. The enforcement is the protection. And enforcement is exactly the thing that is hardest to maintain, because it costs money and attention during all the years when nothing is happening, when the ground is calm and the danger feels like ancient history. Now layer on top of that the situation Venezuela has actually been living through. This is a country that has spent the better part of 20 years in economic collapse and hyperinflation. So put yourself in the position of a developer in that environment. You want to build housing. People desperately need it. Do you spend a great deal of extra money meeting expensive earthquake codes, building in all the steel and the careful engineering, and then find that no one can afford to buy your units? Or do you build cheaply and quickly because cheap and quick is all anyone can pay for? It is a terrible pressure, and it is exactly the kind of pressure that turns a written code into a piece of paper nobody follows. When a country is in that state, enforcement and retrofitting, the strengthening of old buildings, are never the first item on the list. They are not even on the list. And it is worth resisting the urge to simply call this corruption and move on, because the real picture is sadder and more systemic than a few greedy officials. When a currency is collapsing and people cannot afford rent, the pressure to build cheaply is not the moral failing of one developer. It is a force that bears down on everyone at once. The inspector who might have flagged the thin steel is underpaid and overstretched. The agency that might have enforced the code has had its budget gutted by the same crisis. The family that might have demanded a safer apartment cannot afford one and has nowhere else to go. Every individual decision is understandable. And that is exactly how an entire city ends up rebuilt to a standard it already knew decades earlier was not strong enough. The tragedy is not that no one cared. It is that caring had become a luxury the country could no longer afford. And so, a great many of the buildings that fell, or that are still going to fall, were old, unreinforced concrete structures dating back to the oil boom years, when the money flowed and the towers went up fast. It appears they were never reinforced, never strengthened, in all the decades since. They were standing on borrowed time, on dangerous ground, built to a standard that the country had already learned, in 1967, was not good enough. We saw the worst of it in La Guaira, the coastal state below Caracas, where whole buildings pancaked, and where, at first, rescuers had to dig with shovels because no heavy machinery had arrived. Now, whenever a disaster is this large and this sudden, another kind of explanation always rises alongside the real one. Some people look at two great earthquakes 39 seconds apart, and at the other quakes rattling the Caribbean at the same time, and they ask whether all of this could really be natural. Could the quakes be connected? Could they have been triggered or even engineered by some human hand? I understand the instinct, because the timing feels too cruel to be chance. But the physics here is unforgiving. The energy released by a magnitude 7.5 earthquake is so enormous that it dwarfs anything human beings can produce, by many orders of magnitude. To put the scale in perspective, every single step up the magnitude scale represents roughly 32 times more energy. There is no machine, no secret facility, no weather device that comes within a millionth of the power required to set off a fault like this, let alone aim it. The aftershocks on that coast parallel fault are ordinary stress redistribution, the crust settling after a major rupture. The quake near the Lesser Antilles belongs to the same restless plate boundary. The pattern is real, but the hand behind it is the Earth's, not anyone's. And there is a second suspicion worth naming, because it grows directly out of those impossible numbers we started with. When tens of thousands are missing, but only a few dozen have been pulled out alive, some people conclude that the true death toll is being hidden, that the real figure is being deliberately suppressed. I want to be gentle, but honest about this. The reason the missing number is so uncertain is not that someone is concealing it. It is that no one yet knows who was inside 800 collapsed buildings at the moment they came down. The figure is vague because the disaster is uncatalogued, not because it is covered up. The horror is not that the truth is being hidden. The horror is that the truth has not yet been dug out of the rubble. So this is the second half of the answer to why almost 800 buildings fell the same way. It was not only the ground. It was a country that knew exactly what its ground could do, wrote down the lesson, and then, under the weight of crisis after crisis, let that lesson slip away. They knew. That is the hardest part. They knew. But knowing, it turns out, is not the same as remembering. And remembering is not the same as acting. And if you want to understand just how much that difference matters, you only have to look at the countries that made the opposite choice. The ones who took the same hard lesson and refused, for 100 years, to let it go. Let me show you what it looks like when a country decides to actually hold on to the lesson, because the contrast is everything. Japan sits on one of the most violent plate boundaries on the entire planet. It is shaken constantly by earthquakes as large as, and larger than, the ones that just struck Venezuela, including the enormous magnitude 9 subduction earthquakes that are among the most powerful events the Earth can produce. Japan just had another major quake recently. By every measure of raw geological danger, Japan should be a graveyard. And yet, when the large earthquakes come, Japan usually comes through them with a small fraction of the losses that are now unfolding in Caracas. Not zero. Buildings in Japan do fall and people do die. But the scale is utterly different. So people ask, why? And part of the answer is that Japan is probably the best prepared country in the world when it comes to earthquakes. But preparation is not luck. Preparation is a choice that Japan made and then renewed for a century. The turning point came in 1923 with the Great Kanto earthquake, a disaster that killed more than 100,000 people. The very next year, in 1924, Japan brought in one of the world's first national seismic building codes. And then they did the thing that actually matters. They did not write the code once and walk away. They kept rewriting it after every major earthquake. Every time a big one hit, they studied how each building had failed, what exactly broke, and they revised the code to close that specific gap. A landmark revision came in 1981, and its value was proven in the most direct way possible in 1995 during the Kobe earthquake, where the structures built after 1981 mostly stood, while the older ones came down around them. The new buildings lived. The old ones died. The difference was the code and the willingness to enforce it. What Japan really built was not just stronger concrete. It was a society that rests on a permanent assumption. The assumption that the earthquakes will return, because they always do, and that this assumption is the real defense. The steel and the concrete are only the form that assumption takes. That is the thing Venezuela had within reach and did not hold. The Philippines may be the most instructive case of all, because it sits right in the middle, between the country that remembered and the country that forgot. The Philippines absolutely knows the danger. It lies on the Pacific Ring of Fire, crossed by subduction zones and active faults, and it has watched towers fall before, from the Ruby Tower collapse in 1968 to the Luzon earthquake of 1990, which killed more than 1,600 people. And just now, on June 8th of this year, only days before the Venezuela disaster, a magnitude 7.8 struck Mindanao. The Philippines has a national building code with genuine earthquake provisions. They wrote the rules, but they struggle again and again with the same enemy Venezuela could not beat: enforcement. Investigators there keep finding substandard materials. They find plans altered without approval to cut corners, to leave out the steel that costs so much money. They find construction left unsupervised, with no structural engineer ever checking whether the reinforcing steel was actually installed. They find houses built on unstable ground. After the recent quake, investigators found that 30% of villages in one city, General Santos, sit on unstable ground, and the engineers there are left pleading for the code to be applied, rather than merely written, while the geologists warn the authorities that this will not be the last time, that more large earthquakes are coming in the years ahead, and that the preparation can never stop, because the threat never stops. Notice what the Philippines proves, because it may be the most painful lesson of the three. Having the code is not enough. Knowing the danger is not enough. The Philippines has the rules written down, has the scientists sounding the alarm, has the history of fallen towers in living memory, and still the corners get cut. Still the steel gets left out. Still buildings rise on ground that should never have held them. The space between writing a rule and enforcing it is not a small administrative detail. It is the space that people fall through. It is, quite literally, the difference between a building that sways and rides out the shaking and a building that pancakes onto the families inside it. And that warning, the one the geologists keep repeating, is the bridge to the most uncomfortable question of all. Because if this is a story about nations that remember and nations that forget, then we have to ask where we ourselves fall on that line. And there is a place, much closer to home for many of you watching, where a giant is sleeping, where the buildings were raised in the quiet years, and where almost no one alive has ever felt the ground do what it is absolutely going to do. There is a fault off the west coast of North America called Cascadia. It runs offshore from Northern California up past Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia, and it is capable of producing a magnitude 9 or greater earthquake, one of the great subduction events, the same class as the largest quakes Japan endures. When Cascadia ruptures, it will threaten Vancouver and Victoria, the capital of British Columbia, with its old, unreinforced masonry buildings, and cities in the United States like Portland. There are countless buildings across that region, including multi-story concrete towers raised in the 1960s, that were built before anyone fully understood what that fault can do. And here is the psychology that should frighten you, because it is the exact psychology that failed Venezuela. The Cascadia fault ruptures only every 300 to 500 years or so, which means that for generation after generation, nothing happens. Nothing collapses. No one living has felt the great one. And so people forget, not out of stupidity, but because the human mind is built to treat a danger that has never arrived in your lifetime as a danger that is not real. Nothing bad has ever happened. So the building codes were never tested by fire, never reinforced by the memory of a catastrophe, the way Japan's were after 1923 and Mexico's were after 1985. To prepare for Cascadia, the people there would have to do the hardest thing of all. They would have to look at other countries, at Venezuela, at the Philippines, at Mexico, and learn the lesson before the earth teaches it to them directly. Maybe they will, but when you see how easily even a country that had already been hit, a country that already knew, let its guard down, it is hard to feel certain. And the uncomfortable thing is that the warning signs for a place like the Pacific Northwest are not hidden either. The geologists have mapped the fault. They have found the buried evidence of past great earthquakes in the coastal soil, and they have even matched it to the records of a distant tsunami that struck Japan 3 centuries ago, carrying the timestamp of a Cascadia rupture across an entire ocean. The danger is documented in exhaustive detail. What is missing is not knowledge. What is missing is the same thing that was missing in Caracas, the willingness to spend money and attention now, in the calm years, on a catastrophe that no one alive has ever felt. That is the quiet trap, and almost every society walks straight into it, because nothing in human nature rewards preparing for a disaster that may not arrive for another 200 years. And this is not over for Venezuela either. The danger has not passed. Even now, the aftershocks keep coming. A magnitude 4.7 struck west of Caracas, and on its own, it was not strong enough to seriously damage the few sound buildings that remain. But it does something crueler. The continued shaking compacts the rubble of the already collapsed structures, settling it, flattening it, closing the very pockets of empty space where a trapped survivor might still be clinging to life. Roughly 150 smaller tremors have been rattling the region almost without pause. And because that 4.7 occurred on the same coast parallel fault system that produced the two great shocks, it tells us that more segments of that fault are loaded with stress, that there may be enough stored energy to trigger further strong earthquakes in the days and weeks ahead. There was even another earthquake of roughly the same size farther north in the Caribbean, east of the volcanic island arc of the Lesser Antilles, home to famous and historically deadly volcanoes like Mont Pelée and Soufriere Hills. Those volcanoes sit within the broad region influenced by these earthquakes, and they could show signs of activity in the time to come. The ground is not finished moving, and this is the part that the calendar makes so hard to act on. The danger is highest right now, in the days when the fault is still settling and the rubble is still being searched, and then, slowly, it fades into the background. The aftershocks will thin out. The cameras will leave. The international teams will fly home with their search dogs and their supplies. And the great temptation for Venezuela and for every place like it will be to treat the end of the emergency as the end of the danger. But the fault did not go anywhere. The soft ground did not firm up. The unreinforced towers that are still standing on the same soil that just swallowed their neighbors. The emergency ends. The vulnerability does not. And the measure of whether anything was truly learned will not be visible for years, in the quiet decades, in whether the next building goes up with steel in its spine or with foam in its joints and a prayer. So let me bring us all the way back to where we started, to that video, to the foam and the rubble that launched 1,000 accusations. I understand why everyone fixed on it. It is visible. It is outrageous. It feels like a villain you can point at. But the foam was, most likely, the wrong scandal. It was probably an expansion joint, a spacer, exposed by the collapse and mistaken for a column. The real scandal does not crumble dramatically in a rescuer's hand. The real scandal is quieter, and it is worse. It is soft ground that a city was warned about in 1967. It is a building code that was written and then never enforced through the long, hungry decades that followed. It is unreinforced concrete from the oil boom years, left to stand on dangerous soil, waiting. The earthquake did not single out Venezuela for cruelty. The earthquake did what earthquakes always do. It found the gap between what a country knew and what a country did, and it poured 1,400 lives, and tens of thousands more, still missing, straight into that gap. The faults will never stop moving. That is the one thing we can be certain of. Not in Venezuela, not in the Philippines, not off the coast of Cascadia. The earth will shake again, everywhere, forever. What changes the outcome? The only thing that has ever changed the outcome is what we choose to do in the quiet years in between. The years when nothing is happening and the danger feels like someone else's problem. Japan held on to that truth for 100 years. Mexico learned it in a single terrible afternoon and acted. The Philippines knows it and is still fighting to turn knowing into doing. And Venezuela knew it once, wrote it down, and let it slip beneath the weight of another crisis. The disturbing truth the news will not quite say is not about foam at all. It is that almost every one of those 800 buildings could have been a survivor if someone in the long, quiet years had simply refused to forget. The ground will move again. The only question that has ever mattered is whether, this time, we will have built as though we believed it.